Our next discussion is very, very timely, and I wanted to do a poll very informally because I have this question. It's a very personal question for me. Raise your hand if you think 2025 will see more shareholder activism. Well, for those who did not raise your hand, I'm going to assume you mean you're not going to see more, or that you just don't know. So please join me in welcoming our next panel on navigating shareholder activism.
Hi, it's lovely to see everybody. Always a pleasure to be in such an esteemed panel. I'm Jamie Lai. I co-chair the Global M&A practice at Cooley, where we love to deal with activism just as much as we love to deal with deal work. This is an incredible panel in front of you for those of you who have not enjoyed an activism engagement with any of these three folks. You're going to enjoy this panel for sure. We are going to endeavor to keep this very practical, very sort of sophisticated level of discussion. So if there are questions, I'm sure anyone would love to talk offline if there are ways that we can follow up with you. But we really do want to dive in here sort of at the deep end of the pool, giving you real life practical views on what we're seeing from a trend perspective in activism, where we view maybe the new administration or just the change in market dynamics having impact, and thinking through strategies or ways to talk to, if you are a GC, your boards and management teams, if you are a board member, how to think about those various seats you sit in and where to add value. I'm going to let our panel introduce themselves. Their own words are for sure better than mine, and we'll dive in. David, do you want to start?
Sure. Hi. So I'm David Rosewater. I'm the Global Head of Shareholder Activism and Corporate Defense for Morgan Stanley. And I've been in this role since I joined Morgan Stanley now almost 10 years ago. And so I deal with defense situations all day, every day. And I spent 20 years before I joined Morgan Stanley as a lawyer. And for much of that time, I was actually running Schulte Roth's shareholder activism practice, where actually we were mostly advising activists. So kind of the guy that switched sides, but that's okay with me. Morgan Stanley, of course, does not advise activists at all. And that is what I do.
Thanks, David. My name's Sean Donahue. I have not switched sides. I've always been on the defense side, and I represent public companies in defending against activism. I'm the co-chair of the Activism and Takeover Defense practice at Paul Hastings. I sit in our Washington, D.C. office, although I spend a lot of time in New York, and the reason I'm in D.C. is I was at the U.S. Securities and Exchange Commission, the SEC, back in the 2000s before I went into private practice, where I did all kinds of different things, including contested solicitations.
Steve Lippin. As is happening in my life now, I'm the oldest one on the panel. So I've had two careers. My first career was in journalism, where I spent 10 years at the Wall Street Journal, and I covered what was called corporate raiders. It was not called activism. They didn't have LPs. They were raiders. There was green mail. It was a wilder time. But interestingly, a lot of the same characters are still around, the Carl Icahns of the world and the Nelson Peltzes of the world. Then I had multiple kids and lived on the Upper West Side of Manhattan, so I had to get a real job and went into the field of strategic communications, helped build a firm called Brunswick Group in the US. I was the head of that for 17 years, and for 7 years founded Gladstone Group. A number of my colleagues are with me, and we're a strategic comms and IR firm, and we work on a lot of activism defense, like these guys, only representing companies. And also I'm a lecturer at Berkeley Law and teach a class on M&A and activism. Some of my students are here, and Jamie spoke to my students last semester.
So let's start from sort of a macro, and we'll work our way down into the more specific observations about both strategies and tools. But let's do the overview. David, this is what you do with a lot of your time, is go into teams, sometimes experienced teams, sometimes facing an activist, or at least the preparation for the potential of an activist for the first time. How do you look at the macro today? And you're very welcome to include anything in the future that you see coming, but how do we level set with understanding the macro from an activism perspective?
Sure. So what you see today in activism is just a tremendous amount of activity. If you look at the activity this year compared to last, it's about 35 to 40% higher in terms of number of public campaigns by activists. And it is, certainly the US is leading that, but there's a lot of activity globally. The numbers globally are similar. And you see a lot of activity in Europe, but also in Japan and other places. I think Japan is not a place people normally think of as particularly activist friendly, but it has been the largest growth market for activism for a number of years. And so we're just seeing a tremendous amount of activity. And that's not surprising. The markets are good. So the ability to make money for investors is there. They're kind of not fighting the market. And there's always companies out there that investors perceive at least as undervalued, and that is ultimately what activists are looking for. So a lot of activity. I think it's going to continue. My view is, since all of that has occurred without what I would describe as a very robust M&A market, the fact that M&A has been starting to pick up for the last certainly 9 months or a year anyway, and then with the change in administration, at least it's being anticipated that there may be a little bit more opportunity for deals to happen that otherwise might have struggled on situations like antitrust, but also just there's still a tremendous amount of dry powder out there for private equity and strategics who are looking to continue to grow themselves. All of that points to a more robust M&A environment. And if that's the case, since that is often a favored solution of an activist, I would just expect it to be even more active. That is what we're already seeing. Some of it's public already, but a lot of it is still private. But there is a tremendous amount of activity kind of under the surface that I expect to sort of ramp up more significantly into next proxy season. So
and
that's
it's
what I
interesting
expect.
because tomorrow, so a lot of activist positions have come out in the last couple of months, in part because we're right before nomination windows opening, right? And so investors are deciding whether to propose slates. Tomorrow is the deadline for 13Fs. So for those of us, I know many in the room are watching potential activist situations in their own companies, but between a few weeks ago when you have sort of the activist ball, the active passive summit, where a lot of activists go and present their ideas, combined with the 13F filing. So it's not coincidental that Elliott made public its stake in Honeywell a few days ago, because a lot of these positions are going to be made public in coming days, and so we'll all be scrubbing the filing. So timing-wise, this is a well-timed conversation, and I agree completely between private activists and, in other words, those who have not yet revealed their stake and those that already have. And the last point I'd make is that, metaphorically, we have an activist in the White House, and the perception is that, yes, all his friends happen to be activists and raiders, but the feeling is that there's a bit of euphoria from the activist side of the House.
And could one or more of you talk a little bit about the volume of activists in this space and how that's changed in particular over the last couple of years? I think we tend to look at the stats and just see that there's a lot more money sitting waiting to be deployed. But one of the dynamics that's been quite interesting to watch is, there are a lot of offshoots of funds. We now have multiple generations. The old school corporate raiders have rebranded themselves. They still exist, but there are, a next generation and almost a new emerging generation of folks who are playing this game. So could we talk just a little bit about how to think about the differentiated flavors of quote unquote activism, and that can either be by fund or by playbook or by size. Just give a flavor for that adjustment.
Sure. I sort of think of it in three main buckets. The first is it includes those kind of old school raiders and the other folks that everybody knows, right? You've got Elliott and Starboard and Barry Rosenstein at JANA and a whole slew of folks, Nelson Peltz. I think of them as the celebrity activists, right? Those are the ones everybody knows their name. They show up in a situation. It's big news, and people know what to expect. Generally speaking, that's maybe an overgeneralization, but largely that they're there to be activists and to pursue change. The second bucket, I think, kind of developed maybe more like 8 or 10 years ago and continues to grow, which is kind of the occasional activists. People whose business plans aren't primarily to invest in order to be an activist, but are investing, and if they feel compelled for one reason or another, decide to become activists. And there's certainly lots of them. There have been lots of Tiger Cubs on and off who've done things like that. Even folks like Artisan and Neuberger Berman and the like. Those folks are kind of out there, and how that occurs can be quite different, and both pro and con from the point of view of the company for a lot of different reasons. They've often been in the stock because they weren't there to be activists. They may have a different perspective, a different level of credibility about long-term versus short-term, et cetera. But on the other hand, they're not as experienced, and the nature of engaging with them can be different. It can be a little more emotional, et cetera. So that's kind of the second bucket. The third bucket is what you suggested, I think of as the second generation activists. Now that's not all people who came out of other activist funds, but frankly, a lot of it is. And you're seeing people like Charlie Penner from JANA and Engine No. 1 start his new fund. You've got lots of folks who've come out of Starboard and Elliott and other places over the years. And that's kind of, there's just a growing pool of that. And some of them have even come out of other places, come out of Legion or other ones to form new activist funds. They tend to be smaller. They tend to be less well-known. It's not quite as big news. Sometimes, frankly, companies don't realize who they're dealing with. And so, that's why it's important to make sure you're, talking to people like us, if somebody shows up that you don't know, in order to make sure that you are prepared for what could happen and not taken by surprise. Those are kind of the buckets that you have. And oftentimes I get the question from companies, well, I'm small or I'm huge or whatever, would an activist be interested in a company like me? There is an activist for every company, unfortunately.
That's right.
Whether you want
Any size, any type of industry, it really, and the important thing is generally not how big the activist stake is, but how aligned they are with shareholders.
Yeah, just to pick up on David's point quickly, I think that third kind of tier of activists, they also don't have the AUM necessarily to go after a Honeywell or even a company with a $10 billion market cap. So that's why you see a lot of the activism, 2/3 of the activism or so, the high impact campaigns, is actually at companies with market caps of $2 billion or less. And the reason for that is because these smaller funds, they just don't have the firepower to take a big enough stake to go after a large cap, but taking 2-3% of a $1 billion market cap company, they can affect change, and they're well trained. A lot of times they come out of the funds. They tend to be very aggressive. They're unpredictable because a lot of times they only have 2-3 campaigns, or you can see what they did at Starboard. It's not clear they're going to do the same thing at their new fund. They might have a brighter idea than they had that they've been wanting to try out now that they left an Elliott or Starboard. So interesting to defend against and a little bit unpredictable, but also tend to be a little bit less experienced perhaps, so some tactics may work that may not work against an Elliott.
I really agree with that concept that well, first, we regularly get questions on the advisory side of so-and-so moved into my stock. Do you know who this is? And sometimes we do have to sort of figure out the cobbled together history, but they have I would say there is a lot more freedom and also a lot more unknowability about what kind of playbook they might deploy in any particular situation, because the game is a win and they have a lot less to lose than some of the broader names that are, occupying the front page of the Wall Street Journal.
Well, and the new ones want to get attention.
That's
and they
right.
want to raise AUM.
That's right.
So they're going to be, as you said, less predictable, more willing to go public versus there was this trend where activists, after a couple of very high-profile fights, decided, well, maybe we should try to approach companies privately first and see if we could reach a settlement. So the likes of Elliott and Starboard started doing that, but I don't know if others agree. Now I think what's happening is because there's such a competition, I mean, you saw at Salesforce how many names went into that, that because there's a competition in effect to get out first with a particular name, now we're seeing that the activists are less willing to sort of stay private because they're worried about other activists going public in the same name, and to be honest, they want all the glory and credit, and they also sort of want to drive the initiative as opposed to competing with other activists.
So let's talk about a couple of other tools that we see deployed. For sure, timing is a tool that we are watching get sort of reframed, depending on, to David's earlier point as well, what else is going on in the market. But Sean, do you want to talk a little bit about zero slate contests and where we're seeing that playbook deployed, and to maybe varying degrees of success, but for sure being aware of it, I think, is an important piece of the model.
Yeah, so I think we've seen in the last couple of years since universal proxy rules went into effect in September 2022, a little bit of blending of the kind of governance activism and activism where you're going for board seats, and the emergence, even though we've always had them, of so-called zero slate contests where an activist actually doesn't have their own nominees, but they run a proxy fight with their own proxy statement, with their own messaging, and either it's a vote no campaign where they just advocate that the shareholders vote against directors, which actually is relatively powerful with companies that have majority voting. Because if you have majority voting like most larger companies do, and you get a majority of votes against, those directors actually have to resign. So even though you haven't ran your own slate, you can force a resignation on a vote no campaign under majority voting. So it's got some teeth to it. In addition to that, you've seen an emergence of what we're calling non-14A8 proposal contests, or just proposal-only contests. You had a situation where there were 5 shareholder proposals that were put forth with no slate of nominees. And the beauty for the activist on a proposal-only contest is when you compare that versus getting a proposal in the proxy statement under 14A8, the SEC's rule, you're limited to 1 proposal. If you're willing to file your own proxy statement, you can have 8 proposals, 10 proposals. You can do basically anything you want if you're willing to file your own proxy statement, which is, if you're able to control the mailing costs. And I guess the last thing I'll say on that is universal proxy has made that more effective. And the reason is because in either a vote no campaign or a zero slate contest where it's proposals only, you now have the company's nominees on the activist proxy card. So it used to be that these were harder to run because you didn't give the shareholders the option to vote for the company's nominees on the activist card. Now they're on the activist card, so they're easier to vote for. The only trick is, can an activist figure out how to do it inexpensively enough where it's worth it? And I think that's kind of a TBD. I mean, we obviously, Starbucks, the Starbucks contest, there was a lot of money spent there on the Starbucks contest, which was a kind of a S contest. So we'll kind of see how things emerge, but there's definitely a trend we've seen in the last couple of years under universal proxy is these zero slate contests.
I think they're very distracting in a way that is smart on the move, on the activist move, because when you have a slate to also attack, you are playing both offense and defense on both sides, and there's just more to work with. When it's just simply, don't vote for my people, you lose a little bit of the offensive game in the company. And so I like to watch them just to see how people position, basically fighting into a vacuum. It's just it's a much more disorienting game to play, I think. So David, one of the things that I think is misunderstood, particularly in our more local client base here, where we have either true dual-class companies. I love a good dual-class company. I'm never going to argue to make those go away. And we also have often, and this is not just a tech tool, but a heavy concentration of either investors who are pre-IPO that have continued on, and those blocks, shift over time, but for some number of years are pretty formidable. So we have either dual class, or what I love to hear from my management teams, it's no problem, I got the vote. And it's like the biggest red flag I can ever hear, because what I want to say is, no, you don't got the vote, just to be clear. How do you counsel in today's world into either a dual class company or a quasi-controlled company?
Sure.
Where the people aren't lazy? I think they've just become accustomed to thinking that they got the vote and it's no big deal. Where does that tool work for or against today's campaigns?
Yeah, I mean, I think, look, it is still a dual class or a controlled position is still the best defense you can have. Because while you're right, it doesn't, I can rattle off a list of companies that got activists anyway, right? The extent of the campaigns vary, but you're talking about, Alphabet, Meta, Peloton, Pernod Ricard, there's like a whole list of companies that got activists anyway. So it is the best defense you can have, because ultimately nobody can force you to do anything if you have actual voting control. But as I often sort of say to companies, it is very difficult indefinitely to look your shareholders in the face and say, I don't care what you think, right? You had better never need them if that's what you're going to do. And that is tough. It's also tough on the independent directors. Sometimes what you see in sort of controlled company situations is, if the activist really wants to be aggressive about it, they attack the independent directors, right?
That's right.
You've been asleep at the switch. Why haven't you done this? How did you allow this to happen? That kind of stuff. And so, that becomes difficult for, the company and the board to simply, proceed that way. And yes, if the board doesn't want to do what the controller wants them to do, yes, of course they can in theory be replaced, but what's going to happen to your company if independent directors start dropping off because you simply are unwilling to listen? So it is definitely a great defense, but it is more susceptible to activism anyway. And then on top of that, you see stuff like the News Corp situation, where the activist is directly targeting the actual dual class. Now, the history of those campaigns is not particularly successful, but even if there's a substantial non-controlled vote for that, now it's sort of a way to register unhappiness with the situation. And of course, it's not what corporate governance orthodoxy says you should have. So, you do see some of that, but most of it is around persuasion and, sort of the idea that you may end up having to have a public debate about issues that you really, as a company, may prefer not to. And your shareholders may feel like, they're not being considered in the process, and that can make everybody's life difficult.
I think those campaigns also get very personal. You move from sort of the bona fide points that you may differ about in terms of governance or capital deployment or whatever, and you just go straight to why this person is a tyrannical leader that has not had a good idea in 40 years. So it gets pretty dirty pretty fast.
Or why the directors haven't done anything.
Done their job to control the
Well, and to the
power.
point of the last panel or two panels ago, the independent directors, or even the directors who may be part of the control group, are nevertheless very concerned about their own reputations.
That's right.
They're also concerned about not getting majority votes and the so-called zombie directors who are on the controlled board. So we talked about nobody's immune. To David's point, you can't take over a controlled company, but it doesn't mean there's not a lot of anxiety on the board. And the independents want to know that, or the shareholders want to know that you're still thinking about refreshment, and you still need to make the case of why controlled shares are the best way to go. Now, to your point, I don't know many companies, once they have it, that are willingly giving it up. It's not like giving up staggered boards. Most companies have done that. But it's a whole other kettle of fish debating whether to give up your controlled share stakes. So.
And I always try to, although I don't often get takers on this advice, but I do try in our even sort of quasi-controlled companies to remind boards that they are almost always in need of having a proactive position in the market to kind of rebut the presumption that their dual class or their carryover pre-IPO investors aren't by definition hamstringing the company in some other material way. So, write that down for the next time.
Well, and if
we
and
talk about that, but I think people would be very wise to kind of rebut that presumption in their daily interaction, ordinary course IR, and dealings with investors, whether formally or informally. And
The fact is that an activist campaign, even at a controlled company where nothing can actually be forced to be done, is a major distraction and unpleasant and expensive. You'll have to pay all people like us, and nobody wants to do that. And so ultimately, making sure that you are out talking to your investors, listening to what they have to say, taking it into account, maybe not necessarily doing those things, but kind of thinking through how do you communicate in a way that makes your investors understand that whatever it is you're doing, it's because you believe that that's what's best for them, is always going to be incredibly helpful.
Yeah, one prediction on the controlled companies, I think you're going to see, and News Corp is a zero slate contest actually, right? So just kind of you see the blending of what's going on. But I think at some point you're going to see somebody actually run a slate at a control company with shareholder proposals, but maybe run a slate, even though they can't win, and then claim victory if they get a substantial percentage of the majority of the minority vote, essentially being able to say, hey, look, we crushed you. We got 80% of the Class A, ignore the Class B. This is a mandate. 4 directors should resign. We should be appointed. And I think that contest could happen at some point in time. I wouldn't go out if you're a controlled company and think it's going to happen and get ready for it. But I think at some point someone may go super aggressive.
Yeah, I mean, there have been 1 or 2 in history. I mean, it's obviously a long period of time. So it's certainly, as you suggest, not common at all. But I mean, we did one, I don't know, a number of years ago with a company called Turquoise Hill that was controlled by Rio Tinto, and Pentwater ran a slate, and I mean, they had no chance. But it was a situation where there was a lot of emotion about what the company was or wasn't doing, and they ran a full-blown contest and of course lost. But as you rightly suggest, pointed to the independent shareholder tally, and so it can happen. It's not very common at all, and it's sort of like, you can imagine any contest like that's always going to be really quite aggressive, because the only reason someone's doing it is they are feeling very emotional and upset because they know that they have no chance. So it will continue to be extraordinarily rare, as you suggest, but it is, when it does happen, if it does happen again, they're definitely unpleasant.
Well, I worked for a control company, and it didn't save them from being taken over. That company was Dow Jones.
So let's flip the lens a little bit. Let's move from what we're seeing in the activist playbook to what we're using or getting a little more granular with our clients in prep for the upcoming season. What are the tools that we're using from an advisory perspective, or what are we thinking we can maybe deploy in new ways? I'd like to talk about an offensive campaign, Steve. How are we using, particularly in defense of the kinds of press-only campaigns that we know can sort of be turned on and turned off pretty quickly, even without a formal campaign by an activist? How are you talking to clients about offensive campaigns or prep for an offensive campaign?
Well, it comes back to like a little bit of what you guys were saying. What is your narrative? What is your business case and what is your story? Are you telling it consistently? Are you telling it proactively? Is it clear in your annual report? Is it clear in your proxy? When you look at these big activist fights, often the fight is over the narrative. So is the company's narrative sort of taking hold and the activist is sort of critiquing and undermining it, or has the activist actually taken hold of the narrative and then the company is in effect trying to rebut it? Now, in a fight, it's a little bit of both in terms of this season, but more broadly. Often alongside of you guys, we basically come in and act as the activist and critique the company's story, and then say together with the company advisors, how are we going to respond? What are the responses to the critiques? Let's get ahead of the activist. The prior panelist, there was a panelist who said that often the activists are right. They may be right, they may be wrong, but you should not be surprised by not just an attack, but what the arguments are in the attack. If you were surprised by the arguments that the activists are making, that's a problem. And so part of our job is pre-nomination window season, making sure our clients have thought about the criticism. Sometimes they're even starting to weave those rebuttals into their quarterly earnings releases. So it's the narrative. The press part, the activists are very savvy. The activists are very press savvy. They know how to leak to the outlets. They're quite often quite good on CNBC, and CNBC becomes almost like their
megaphone.
The megaphone. So it's the megaphone for the activists, but also, in effect, the companies very much are responding on CNBC. So these fights become press battles, and we'll get into a little bit of some of the other tactics, but there's sort of the short-term plan, which is like, what do you do in the first 24 hours of a fight, right? The so-called break the glass, but really getting into the counter-arguments, understanding where the criticisms are. The criticisms may not be an economic one. It may be, we don't like your dual class. It may be the makeup of your board. The panel on board refreshment was excellent because one of the things that we all say to clients 6-8 months before proxy season is, let's look at your board refresh. Are there weak links? And in the world of universal proxy, it is not my slate against your slate. It's literally a fight for the individual directors. So part of the planning, and we may have a chance to talk about the role of board, but part of the planning is not just defense of the board, it's actually defense of every director who is either up for election or who would be targets in a universal proxy contest.
So let's pick up that thread just for a second, and you don't have to own your viewpoints outside of this room if you don't want to afterwards. But this idea of sort of preparedness, whether that is because you are coming into your proxy season, because you've been watching your peers. I always also tell people, watch your peers. Watch what they're doing, not doing. Watch how their ordinary course IR activity hits, doesn't hit. You always know when your peer got to a certain investor before you did, because suddenly that investor is asking you different questions than they ever asked you before. Do you feel like our companies, doesn't matter, small, mid, large cap, are choosing to do as many different kinds of things that they could choose from in order to be more offense in their thinking? And if the answer is no, what's like the one or two things you would say, I really wish you would fill in the blank?
I think, I think a lot of companies, it is certainly true. So when I started doing this, I don't know, 20 years ago or whatever it was, there was none of the preparation. I was obviously on the activist side at that point, but companies just ignored activists and just didn't think they had to do anything. That has certainly changed, and because shareholder activism is so prominent these days, I think a lot of companies understand that some level of preparation is of value. I think the question is, what is the most effective things that you can do? And I think, probably if I had to pick like two things, I think one is, board refreshment, I think is really important. And I think, the panel before was great, and I think all of that is all true. But, it is also a fact of life that oftentimes companies are slower than they should be to really action sort of board refreshment, or at least, even if they are actioning it, they have not done an effective job of explaining what the plan is. And therefore, you can say till you're blue in the face after an activist shows up, well, I've been refreshing and we're going to be continuing to do that. No one believes you.
Yeah.
Right? And so, I think talking a little bit about the refreshment plan is something that companies don't do very much of, that I personally think is something that would be more useful for companies. The other thing is really, not only looking at what are the arguments going to be about what you've either done wrong or what you should be doing, but importantly, what are your answers, right? A lot of companies, they get presentations about, well, here are your vulnerabilities, and there's sort of, oh, well, but of course it's not all true, and we're working on that, and whatever. There's a lot of that. But really thinking through what is my best answer is something that, companies, I think, don't always do as proactively as they should. Now I realize this is what I do for a living, so when you're a hammer, everything looks like a nail. I get that, but I think where do you not want to be? You don't want to be in a situation where an activist shows up, they're accusing you of something, or they're complaining about something, or they're demanding that you do something, and you feel pressured to give an answer. And then a little later, you wish you'd given a slightly different answer. And now you're in trouble, because either you're going to change your answer, and your shareholders are going to look at that and say, oh, you're just backing into the answer you want, not what the right answer is, or you're stuck with a suboptimal answer. So I think that those two things, it's obviously a broad category, but I think really thinking that through is one of the things that companies would be really well advised to do proactively.
And the other thing is like skills matrix in your proxies. We've been working with a lot of companies on, do you have one? And if so, how deep are they? And even the bios of board members, not just your bio, but what you bring, what your director brings to the board. And so back to like, what further additive things could you be doing? Were you looking at director bios? What do they specifically bring? And looking at either making sure you have a skills matrix or updating your skills matrix with both board refreshments, and just looking at it through the lens, ensuring your directors are sort of getting the full credit for their experiences, because often actually there's a lot more experience that they have that just doesn't show up in your proxy.
I agree that taking credit for what you are doing well is something companies for some reason kind of don't like to do as much as I would expect. And then the other point that you made, David, is really understanding what even if you aren't going to start giving your best answer to the street on a clear day, you can start interweaving at least some version of your answer to some of the questions in a way that feels palatable to the company. Because the worst thing on the planet is to have literally just made one set of statements in your last run through your core investors, activist appears, and you suddenly say something 180 degrees different. Like, you are just by definition in a ditch you are unlikely to get yourself out of over the course of whatever unfolds.
For sure. And I just want to pick up on one thing that Steve said, because I think it's really important, which is in the world of a universal proxy, I think the most important thing that you can do in your proxy statement or when you're talking about your board is, what is every single person on that board, what is the fundamental reason that that person needs to be on your board? What skill set are they bringing that you don't have otherwise, right? I think everybody has the skills matrices, and I think those are helpful, but pretty much everybody gets a check mark for everything, and it kind of, it wanes in its usefulness if that happens. But making sure that you can articulate why is it that that person needs to be on your board and what role they're playing based on their sort of fundamental skill set is really important. In a way that it was always important, but it's much more important now that, as Steve described, that it's, hand-to-hand combat on this director versus that one.
Sean, can you talk a little bit about institutional versus retail in today's sort of prep or offensive planning? And I always, first thing, I'm sure you do this too, what's your stock watch telling you and where's your investor list? How do you categorize it? Not just institutional and retail, but with respect to engagement. How often are you in the cadence with this crew? When you go into a new client or a mandate, how are you looking at those things?
Yeah, I think literally the first thing we do is assess the shareholder base, right? I mean, you have to look who's the institute, how much institutional versus retail, where do they lean? Do they have their own voting guidelines, or are they going to follow ISS and Glass Lewis? How influential are ISS and Glass Lewis? And the big kind of wild card or change to me is just the rise of retail and how much retail there is in these fights. And it's not just that there's retail, it's that the retail sometimes now actually shows up and votes and may not vote for management. Historically, for years we always said, oh, the retail will vote with management, and in certain campaigns that's still the case. But you go down into the smaller cap space, there's companies that have gotten absolutely crushed because the retail just hated the shareholder, just hated the company, and especially in the life sciences space. So I think it depends on market cap. It depends on what industry you're in. And I guess I would just say kind of holistically, whether it's prep, whether it's a live mandate on a fight, I think you really have to look at the specific situation, the specific board, the specific industry, what the attack vectors are going to be, what the shareholder base looks like, and what's the play going to be, right? If you have a lot of retail and you're in life sciences and the company's trading below its, the market cap of the company is below its cash value, you got to be ready to defend against a liquidation play, which at the end of the day, you don't really have to defend against at a lot of other companies, right? And if it's a large retail base that might want some cash, that's going to be a tough fight to win. So I just think knowing the base, the shareholder base, is hugely important. And I think stock surveillance, you got to know who's coming in and out of your stock, and you can't just wait for each quarter when the Fs come out, because it's just too challenging to only get it 4 times a year. And if I could put a request in for the SEC, I'd like to see that little window closed a little bit, but we'll see what happens with the 13F reform.
The retail is interesting because we sort of grew up in the world where retail disappeared. Everything was held by mutual funds, and then you had the rise of the individual investor, Robinhood. We had a situation, I'm sure some in the room, Churchill, Four, and Lucid, where it wasn't about actually voting against the deal. They didn't know where their shares were.
Right.
We were going on Reddit. We were on StockTwits, literally getting a quorum. But there is something I want to bring up about this institutional retail. So all the big institutions, State Street, BlackRock, and Vanguard, have these programs where they have been piloting that they're going to be expanding, which in Vanguard it's called Investor Choice, BlackRock it's called Voting Choice, State Street Proxy Voting Choice. And basically, they are giving back to the individual shareholders the voting rights. And this is something people should be aware of. It's going on because, for various reasons we won't get into, the big institutions are, in effect, trying to empower the individual investors to vote their shares. And while small now, it's something to think about because, for the most part, I suspect in this room, most of your companies are held by institutions. But those, I'm sure you have BlackRock and Vanguard and State Street in those in your register, and this is something that's sort of coming.
One very interesting potential unintended consequence of voting choices, those 3 funds you mentioned that have their own voting guidelines and don't follow ISS and Glass. Now that you're going to have voting choice, the people more downstream may follow ISS and Glass, and it may actually increase ISS and Glass's influence in a potential proxy fight under voting choice. So there could be some unintended consequences. Even though it's meant to empower shareholders, it may actually cause them to rely on the proxy advisory firm recommendations a bit more. So to be determined what we see on that.
We could obviously talk at you all day about an enormous topic. There are whole conferences dedicated to just this. So I am going to thank you each profusely for cramming so much knowledge into 45 whole minutes. I do think the next proxy season is going to be a very interesting and wild one. So even if you sit in a company or you hold investments that you think are more boring than volatile, I think a little extra eye on the news will be good prep for watching what will be an interesting market. As David started, the panel I'll end, as we watch the market get more exciting, a lot of these funds want to ride the up, and we will see more activity, I think, than in prior cycles for sure, and I look forward to comparing notes with all of you next year. Thanks.
Thank you, Jamie.
Thank you.
Jamie.